Hi, everybody. Thank you for taking the time to join us today for this webinar. Today, we are proud to launch our latest paper called The Next Act. This paper explores the future of sustainability legislation and is designed to help organizations stay ahead of changes in the UK, US, EU, and China. To explore this topic further today, our CEO, Verde Nieto, is joined by Emma Pavanelli, member of the Italian Senate, Joe Hewitt and Reagan Demas, partners at the law firm Baker McKenzie. Before we start, I want to remind you that this session will be 45 minutes, including 15 minutes of Q&A at the end. Over to you, Diana.
Thank you so much, Claudia, and thank you so much, Reagan, Joe, and Emma for joining us this afternoon. It's not a surprise that humanity has been aware of climate change for almost 50 years. Yes, you heard it correctly, 50 years now. We have been talking about climate change, but I think right now is the first time that actually government is actively listening. And although many companies have taken voluntary actions in an uncoordinated manner for many years, today we are experiencing unprecedented realization from governments that unless legislation is put in place, and is put in place quickly, we won't be able to tackle collectively the biggest threat that humanity is facing today, and that is actually climate change. We need to acknowledge the T word and the A word that make companies and CEOs around the world very scared. This is the accountability word and the transparency word. And let's make sure that this time we don't faff around and actually properly take action to sort this problem out. I like to kind of go to this incredible panel, and I start my first question to Emma, actually. I mean, Emma, you are at the Senate today. You're making laws, you're making change, you're actively doing something to help us to get out of this mess. So I would like to ask you, from a European focus, how is the European and Italy thinking about climate? What are the key EU issues to talk about? For example, carbon, sustainable production, reporting, transparency. So what are the actions that are in conversations today in Italy and in the European Parliament?
Yes, hello to everybody, and thank you for inviting me to your panel. It is very important at the moment for all countries, all nations, really to start taking serious positions regarding everything that is related to climate change. We are living in a new revolution. Just like we did during our ancestors did during the Industrial Revolution, we have to do an ecological revolution. So at the moment, the EU is taking actions with different degrees, different laws from. We can see the Green New Deal. It is going towards new incentives for renewable energy. It is going towards incentives for new mobility that has to take into account of the emissions. Also, it has voted just a few weeks ago, Fit for 55, which is towards reducing our climate footprint. And at the same time, due to the COVID, due to the pandemic, all EU countries are receiving a huge amount of money to, let's say, push the economy and to start over again, but to start over again with an ecological insight. Therefore, there's a lot going on in all countries, because we only have about 5 years to spend this big amount of money, which is money that is dedicated to post-COVID, but it is all related to eco-sustainability and everything that is related to a better environment. At the same time, a lot of laws, a lot of directions that the EU had already taken just 2 years ago before the pandemic, they are already changing them to improve them. I can give you just an example. Let's say single-use plastic waste, the directive, we are at the moment in Italy, but also in other countries, we are just putting together all the details of the new law. But I just had the news just a few days ago that the EU is already changing it. So by the time we're voting it here, there's already a new one coming in. At the same time, it is working. The EU is working to new industrial strategies, for example, for the clothing sector, for this industry definitely needs to change. It needs to change worldwide, but the EU is trying to tackle down all of the main issues regarding the textile industry to do a new EU directive, which we really hope will be just the base so that all other countries will then adapt and start working towards having a more sustainable textile industry, which is actually already happening. Because we must remember that many companies, many startups are already doing a lot. Small companies, but also bigger companies. But the laws are somewhat arriving later than what consumers are actually asking, because they're asking for more sustainability in all sectors, not for the food industry, for the textile industry, also the hotel industry. I am seeing even here in Rome, they are changing, they are reducing their plastic, they are reducing everything that is unnecessary, even regarding the water consumption, the electricity. Therefore, there is a lot of change. Of course, we can always do better, and we also have to tackle, the greenwashing that might come into the system. But I can see that there is a big movement and a lot of change.
Thank you very much, Emma. Of course, government, and this is not a dig to you, but government's quite slow, and definitely the consumer is actually globally now pushing for better legislation, for more transparency, for more accountability for brands, but most importantly, suppliers. I mean, a lot of that is in the suppliers' hands. So it's about finally everybody working collaboratively and together to really actually make the step change that we really need to make as not just as a country or as a continent, but as a one planet, basically. And this takes me to you, Reagan, because the last time that we spoke, Biden had probably day number 3. He already had the first 100 days. He rejoined the Paris Agreement, which is super exciting. And the US has made incredible step change to really move soft legislation and legislation along. So, I mean, please, if you can share with us, what actions have you seen? Can you talk about what legislation is coming up and what is coming in the horizon? And also, you know a lot about sustainability from a supply chain vulnerability perspective. So if you can also share a little bit more about that topic as well. No pressure, over to you.
Only that. All right, 45 minutes, got it. No, look, it's interesting hearing Emma talk from the EU perspective. I think when we talked 6 months ago, we anticipated a wave, and we've gotten a wave. Now, the way waves work in government is they're more like tsunamis, right? So you have the rising tide, and that's what we see in the U.S. as we expected. But we're all catching up with you, Emma, on the U.S. side, of course, right? But we're working hard to do that, if I speak on behalf of the Biden administration. So let me try to hit a few of the key points, because there's been a lot going on. Obviously, in the wake of the supply chain executive orders, at least as it relates to the supply chain side, there's been a number of deeper dive reports and essentially demands by the executive, by the administration, to various aspects of the U.S. government to take action as it relates to sustainability and supply chains. One of the biggest ones of those is a real pressure on the SEC, the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, to implement rigorous reporting requirements around sustainability. This is not just in supply chains, right? And this will have a significant impact. We saw the impact this had with conflict minerals several years ago, right? And if this in fact comes into play, and we've seen it started, the SEC has put together a task force focused on ESG and sustainability. They have taken comments and requests from companies and outside parties on what this will look like. And I know Joe will talk more about this kind of from the EU standpoint, but this is one significant area where the question really is, are we going to see sort of the soft requirements that it's not if we'll see something, it's will we see soft requirements out of the SEC that are a little bit more mushy, or are we going to see sort of these hard requirements that are really going to require very detailed reporting that's going to lead to other expansion of risk and things like litigation, and that I know we talked about last time, and I can hit on the current status of that as well. So that's one significant area. We've also seen there's obviously, the U.S. Congress now is not a place that's particularly productive, let's be honest. There's not a lot that's bipartisan, but there are some components of sustainability, especially as it relates to supply chains, that are bipartisan, that impact this industry. And one of the key ones of that is anti-human trafficking and anti-forced labor. There's actually legislation on the Hill in the United States that would catch the U.S. up with the EU. It's still working its way through Congress, and despite even bipartisan things, have trouble getting through the U.S. Congress these days. But there's no doubt we'll see legislation at some point in the relatively near future at the federal level in the U.S. that will require due diligence on suppliers as it relates to trafficking and forced labor, that S component of ESG. And will require reporting of metrics to the Department of Labor in the U.S. and could even have specific liability impacts for companies. So that's another area. There's also broader legislation that's passed the U.S. House, which is the more progressive body in the U.S. Congress, that relates to ESG metrics and disclosure. So they're also pushing the SEC from a legislative standpoint. That's not yet passed both houses of Congress, but we're seeing pretty substantial pushes on all that side. The last point I'll make is just the U.S. Customs and Border Protection have also taken a surprisingly leading role in this within the bounds of Section 1307, which allows customs in the U.S. to block shipments at the border of any product, including a lot of this is textiles, that are believed to source from forced labor. Not just the supplier, but the tier 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 suppliers. And what we've seen is a significant uptick in this. I've had several clients in the last 2 weeks contact us with urgent issues on this. And it turns out customs taking a very hard line on this. They're not allowing companies to come in and say, oh, we don't think this is forced labor, trust us, and they release this product. They're requiring essentially proof of a negative, right? You have to prove it's not from forced labor, which is another reason why, and to your last point, Diana, the key issue here for companies remains putting in place some sort of risk-based program on responsible sourcing so they can understand where products coming from and be able to respond to all of these risks, whether it's a civil liability lawsuit from a consumer group, whether it's customs blocking a shipment at the border, or whether it's reporting obligations that I know Joe will talk more about shortly.
Thank you so much. I mean, this is exactly what we're seeing. I mean, we have a certification, not just for brands, but also for suppliers. And we are actively helping suppliers to really understand, like you said, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 within their own supply chain. So therefore, brands can very easily get hold of this understanding of where the products come from, where the raw materials come from, and actually we can actually drive systemic transparency. And I say always the T word, because obviously every time we talk about transparency, people are like, oh my God, but actually transparency is good. I mean, Joe, talking about transparency, let's talk about reporting, because one cannot go without the other one. And you're the queen of reporting. So, I mean,
monumental.
I mean, how important is transparency and reporting? I mean, nowadays, and how you're seeing the acceleration of that in the future, and also, I mean, if you can touch not just obviously you're based in the UK, we have Brexited, so we have 3 different bodies of law right here. But you know, if you can touch UK, obviously the EU, and also the US and the wider world as well. Thank you very much, Joy.
Absolutely. Thanks, Diana. So yeah, absolutely. Reporting is a huge topic here. The tsunami of legislation around ESG matters is not all about reporting, but you might be forgiven for thinking it is, because there is so much that is focused on that sort of transparency agenda. And it's almost felt as though over the last few years, legislators have had, you know, that major thing in their tool belt has been trying to flush out bad practice and trying to encourage best practice by forcing disclosure and transparency around ESG topics. So talking about, you're right, Diana, we're sort of on a 3-speed approach to reporting here, because the UK in some ways was ahead of the curve, not in all ways, but in the UK over recent years, we have seen this absolute mushrooming of ESG reporting requirements. And it's not just about climate, by the way. I know this, you know, that was sort of where you started at the top of this webinar, but it's far broader. You know, it's around carbon emissions, but it's also around issues like gender pay gap, modern slavery. And all of this is set to continue. In the UK, we're going to get, and it's already in train, we're getting mandatory TCFD, Task Force on Climate Related Disclosures, mandatory reporting both for listed companies and large unlisted companies. So this is not just about your listed topco. This is about all throughout your organization if your subsidiaries are large enough. And we're also potentially going to have ethnic pay gap reporting requirements coming down the line in the UK as well. That's been out for consultation. So we'll see where that goes. So the UK has been on this train. You know, there's been this absolute mushrooming of legislation. And one of the things we've been helping clients to do is try to, you know, make sense of it, because it's not all, it's not all of a piece. Some of it goes in your strategic reporting, your annual accounts, your statutory accounts. Some of it goes into a central register. Some of it just goes on your website. There's a whole sort of patchwork of ESG related reporting requirements that have been quite tough for clients to understand. And you know, the UK has not been alone. We've seen we've seen equivalent legislation in Australia, California, actually, on the modern slavery front, Canada, other places too. And you know, in terms of the EU piece, you know, clearly we're now sort of operating on separate tracks, but I think that, you know, the themes are the same. And what was maybe a bit more of a murmur in terms of the kind of EU reporting requirements have now become an absolute roar. And it was announced in spring this year that the non-financial reporting directive was going to be reviewed. And this was part of the green finance package announced in the spring. There's going to be a new corporate sustainability reporting directive, CSRD. And there's quite a few things that are interesting about this development that I think are relevant to this discussion. So for one thing, they haven't called it NFRD2, Non-Financial Reporting Directive 2. And one of the reasons that was given for that at the time of the consultation was, you know, these factors are not non-financial. They will affect the bottom line sooner or later. So therefore, moving away from that idea that there's financial reporting, which is the serious stuff, and then there's this fluffy reporting, you know, all this stuff is absolutely relevant to the bottom line. The second thing that's really interesting about it, it's going to capture a far broader range of companies in the EU. So I think the Commission itself estimates that it's going to capture something like 50,000 companies, where the NFRD captures about 11,000. And again, unlisted companies are caught as well. The third thing that's interesting about it, and I would say this maybe as a governance specialist, but the CSRD is really going to highlight and require reporting on the very specific role of the board and senior management in sustainability matters. So it's no longer going to be enough to say, oh, sort of, you know, directors, you know, delegate all of that, and we've got a sustainability department and we've got sustainability officer even, but actually, that's all great. But what this reporting is going to drive at is how does the board really understand the sustainability agenda, the sustainability pressures on the business? How is this informing their day-to-day strategy? This is not an overlay to strategy. This has got to be a fundamental part of it. So this is all coming down the line. And I think that focus on the board as well has very much been a feature of the UK legislation. And this is, something which even wholly owned subsidiaries, their boards are needing to think about how specifically they report on their company's approach to sustainability matters.
Absolutely. And if you're thinking of appointing a celebrity to your board, rethink again about somebody that actually can understand sustainability in a 360 perspective and specialize in different areas, diversity and inclusion, supply chains and so on. So really can help CEOs to inform of how to embed. Finally, we're talking about embedding sustainability into your corporate strategy in order to drive the bottom line. This can be, 23 years saying the same thing is a very long time. And I'd like to change slightly the topic, but not too far away from where we're discussing, which is greenwashing. Of course, for a long time we have been hearing about this, and we have heard, and as pressure as mounting from a legislative perspective, companies are attempting to actually go and enhance the marketing and communications, and always the idea is another campaign or another collection or another product that is green. So the question to actually you all, and I like to start with Emma, is like, what have you seen regarding, the green claims code that is very much installed in the EU, and of course Italy as part of the EU. And then, Reagan, if you can tell us a little bit the US perspective, and then Joe, if you can talk about the rest of the world, and of course the UK will be fantastic. So can I kickstart this question with you, Emma?
Yes, well, you can see a lot of greenwashing just looking at products when you go to a supermarket in reality, where all labels are now all brown or green, just as a color. And that attracts your eye and makes you think that, of course, it is going to be, it might actually have a recycled packaging or, other anything that could be ideal and environmentally okay. But in reality, what I am actually even asking here in Italy, but I think is going to happen all over, is that we need to have specific labeling. Now you also have, the famous 3 arrows that go around, and now you don't understand what does it mean? Does it mean it's a recycled packaging, or is it a packaging that is recyclable, or is it both? Therefore, if you don't have an eye or the curiosity to know, what you're actually buying, often you actually don't actually understand it. And we have to make things simple, not because, of course, people and consumers are not intelligent, but just because we need to give them the good direction of where to put their to dispose of all of their rubbish, or at the same time understand the difference between a regenerated T-shirt or a partial regenerated T-shirt, or because that is what's happening. A lot of the fast fashion is going towards, okay, my garment is from regenerated textile. Okay, how much regenerated textile is there in your T-shirt? Therefore, I think it is very confusion. And here we come again to the word you were using before, which is transparency. Okay, so we really need to understand, okay, I'm using a plastic recycled bottle for my drink. Great. How much water are you consuming? Or are you polluting in the country where you're producing? Because that too has a global effect, and it actually affects all of us. We can't just say, oh, but it happens in that country, therefore it who cares? No, that only means, pushing away the problem to your neighbor. And that is not, in a global world, we really need to think globally. So that is one point, that is very important. The other point is that, we really, as consumers, must make better choices and start, being choosy in a way. And doing that will for sure push companies to do better and, to go towards the ideal direction, which is not always easy, because sometimes we think that a product is actually sustainable, but then you start thinking of where it comes from, the water they consume, the energy they consume, and at the end of the day you think, well, is it really sustainable? So that is, I think, one of the questions that all companies that are thinking of also changing their productions should start thinking about.
Thank you very much, Emma. I mean, Reagan, what do you see in the US?
Well, I have to say this might be one area where we're actually ahead of the rest of the world, at least in some ways, which is rare in this area. And I don't know that I'm necessarily proud of it, but look, we have a cherished litigious history in the United States, and we sue each other for all sorts of things, and people are suing each other over this. And so our history of loving to file lawsuits against each other is coming back to roost on this issue. So what we're seeing is a significant litigation, and it continues to rise against companies that are greenwashing, essentially, and not just the greenwashing, but the S equivalent of that, right? For making statements and claims about their products, about their supply chains, right? About how they have no forced labor in supply chains. And so far, companies have sort of fended off most of this litigation, and it happens under state laws. Like California has very robust and, frankly, traditionally laws that were used for nuisance litigation are now being used for these sorts of claims by activist groups and consumers. And most of these settle out of court, but there's significant, challenges for large companies that are trying to do the right thing by making claims about their supply chains, for example, or their products, but they aren't always true, or they're misleading. And, the real solution to this is for companies to actually have what I talked about earlier, some sort of program that allows them to actually know that what they're saying is true. Imagine that, right? But also have a process within the company for vetting claims. Because traditionally, a lot of these claims would come out of the public affairs group or marketing or sustainability, legal, or even some of the substantive part, environmental and health, or the merchant groups or supply chain wouldn't always even have much say into what's being put in an ESG report. And that has to change, and it is changing, where lawyers have to sit down and look and say, okay, we're claiming in this report that we are paying a living wage to all our suppliers. Well, what does that mean exactly? I mean, by the way, what is a living wage? What you think is may not be what I think it is, or what a consumer group thinks it is. So it's really important to, at the US, that sort of, and it's not just litigation. We also obviously have like the FTC, the SEC is taking action on this, where it's material to companies and they're making claims that aren't true as it relates to this issue. It's significant. So I would say that risk for companies in the U.S. remains pretty substantial.
Thank you very much. And Joe, I mean, what are you seeing where you sit?
Yeah, no, it's interesting. And you're right, Reagan. I mean, this might be an area where, us diffident Brits and Europeans are, the litigation risk is more of an emerging risk at the moment, but it is real and it's growing. But I suppose what I would say about the greenwashing point is, for most of what we're seeing, I think, is it's not that there are organizations that are totally sort of cynically trying to jump on the ESG bandwagon in order to sell their products and their ESG claims are entirely false. I mean, there may be some of that going on, but for the most part, organizations are really kind of struggling with this. And actually, one of the massive challenges around ESG and doing ESG well, when we look at it in all of its components, is it's such a vast topic. It encompasses everything from carbon emissions to biodiversity, water usage, inclusion and diversity in your workplace, forced labor, some of the other issues that we've already covered. They are so vast, and it's developing all the time. On the S side, 2 years ago, we probably weren't talking about the ethnic diversity issues as much as we are now. The events overtook. So companies were needing to make statements last year around their position on Black Lives Matter, Stop Asian Hate, those types of things. You're having to move with events all the time and sometimes take a quick position to be on the right side of history and to genuinely, motivated by wanting to do the right thing, but sometimes falling foul of, moving too fast there and making claims that can't be stood behind. But I think what it illustrates, really, that sort of greenwashing risk is that what a lot of organizations, businesses are crying out for, and this is across industries, actually, not just in luxury, but across industries, is some sort of some sort of verifiable sense of what good looks like, because no one will be perfect, and there is no such thing as a sort of perfect ESG score. And you won't be able to report a perfect ESG score in your reporting. And to some extent, that's the transparency is about sort of highlighting the areas where you're still improving, still on a journey. But really what it highlights is that need for, measurable goals, consistent standards, some sort of structure, and probably some sort of market collaboration, actually, but, even with your competitors around, what the right standards should be. And I know that's, something I talk to my antitrust colleagues a lot about is, to what extent can companies collaborate with their competitors around, coming up with best practice around ESG matters. That's a fraught area, but I think I think if we're going to kind of move away from the kind of greenwashing risk, you really do need that level of standardization.
Absolutely. I mean, and with the pace and this is moving, we probably will get there maybe in 10 years time. That is too late. So in the meantime, one of the things that we're seeing is like benchmark and measure yourself against yourself and then against your industry. So when you don't have like, okay, this is global, this is what we can do, let's start with the absolute basic. But you are completely correct. It will be fantastic to have this industry kind of collaboration. And I'm hoping that before 2050, this actually happens. We have some questions from the audience. I have one question for you, Joe, which is any difference of ESG legislation between the EU and China?
Thanks, Hannah. Yeah, so I'm not an expert on China, but what I do know is that this is is an emerging area in China, and where 5-10 years ago we would not have been talking about ESG reporting legislation in China. That is a changing picture. So it's been incremental. There've been some recent law changes mandating listed companies to report on kind of governance arrangements, but also environmental risk, and that's a new requirement. So I think it started with the requirement to sort of disclose if you'd been fined for sort of breaches of environmental regulation, waste management regulation, that type of thing. You had to sort of disclose if you'd been guilty of any of those offences. But what is now the case is that the reporting requirement is more around, what we would see as the sort of TCFD type of reporting around, what's your business's impact on the wider environment? What's the impact climate change will have on your business? I mean, it's certainly an emerging picture. It's not the same position in China as it is in the EU or the UK, but it's certainly, on that track.
Thank you very much. I'm not really sure who would like to tackle this question, but I think it's a combination, Emma and Joe. Sorry, Reagan, for this, but do you anticipate that the EU and the UK legislation will mirror each other? Specifically on the garment production side, I mean, but overall?
I think that if the EU takes some radical decision, I think that at that point, not only the UK, but a bit all of the countries will have to change a bit. Also because they are talking a lot about a new labeling, which in reality, some companies, some brands are already using. At the moment, the idea would be like a QR code where you could actually, as a consumer, check all the information that you actually want to have. So it could be how much water you've used for that garment? Have you used chemical dyes for that garment? Have all the workers have equal pay? Just a series of information. And I think that is the direction that a lot of companies, even very small companies, because remember that the EU actually doesn't have big producing companies, but it mainly has small and very small producing companies. Italy is the #1 country with the most companies, but generally they are considered small and very small, as a lot of the production, as you know, has gone elsewhere in other or EU countries or outside the EU. Therefore, this will have to push even other companies, if they want to work with the EU brands or within the EU, they will have to adapt to that kind of labeling. And I think that in the long run, as we've had similar labelings for the food sector that requires transparency, or the cosmetic area that has required transparency, it has in some way at the end influenced also other countries to do the same. I think that will happen in a way or another.
Thank you. I mean, Joe, do you see the same?
Yeah, so I mean, Emma's better placed than I am to talk about the sort of specifics around the textile industry. But if I could maybe comment more sort of generally about the green agenda, I think this is probably one area, maybe it's one of the few areas where we still think there's going to be a lot of alignment between the UK and the EU. So around the same time, or maybe a few months ahead of the EU announcing its sustainable finance package, its sort of green package, and the Green Deal, Boris Johnson was announcing the 10 Green Point Plan for the UK, which is maybe sort of what you might expect from Boris Johnson, sort of higher level, and maybe a sort of a bit more succinct, but certainly kind of aligned in ethos. And I think there are genuinely a lot of hopes around COP26 in November in Glasgow, bringing kind of alignment on particularly sort of net zero targets. So I think this is probably one area where we will see a lot of alignment. I suppose what I'm not seeing at the moment necessarily that's quite as aligned, alignment on the E. I think probably on the S, the UK is still, possibly kind of leading the charge on some of that S reporting around gender pay gap, as I mentioned the potential for ethnic pay gap reporting. Some of that we're not necessarily seeing, in that specific way in the EU.
Thank you very much, Joe. And actually, this question has not come from public, comes from my curiosity. I mean, do you see the same in the US, Reagan?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think they're sort of things are aligned on that front. But Diana, I actually want to, if I can just answer a question that just came in, which I think is excellent. I want to make sure we have time for this. Sorry to punt, but this is like a great question and it's practical, and I think people are going to want to hear that. So somebody has asked how we move sustainability from kind of a single function or a special project to being fully embedded in organizations. And cited things like digital, where it was sort of chief digital officers were put in place. I think this is a really important and a great question because, and I want to encourage companies and people listening that this is exactly what we saw with compliance more generally, frankly, right? Remember, everyone was talking about compliance and no one really knew what it means, just like no one really knows what sustainability means, really. And they appointed chief compliance officers because they felt like they had to not get in trouble with people. And over the years, what we've seen are the following kind of things that really allow it to embed. Things like tone at the top, where it's actually not just talking the talk, but walking the walk, right? So, and that's the same thing with sustainability, like thinking about, okay, we have a group that's saying things and trying to do all the right things with our stakeholders, but how is this sort of backward facing? How is this impacting how we act within our company? And are we really walking the walk? And that's what happened with, it was not just, it was a culture change, really, when it came to things like compliance and anti-bribery and not dealing with sanctioned parties. There was a legal risk component that caused people to do this, but it was a culture change. And I think we're going to have to see something similar where, you know, the marketing people, the merchants, the purchasers, the supply chain people, they're actually going to really have to believe this is important, right? And not just sort of say, oh, I'm told this is important and consumers like it. Like, is there a culture change? And so I think there's a map for how this works based on what we've seen in the broader world of compliance. And so I would encourage companies to take that same approach. Think about integrating sustainability into existing compliance programs, into existing training programs, into existing, statements by leadership, right? To where it really is embedded in the culture of the company.
Thank you very much. Really well said. We don't have much time, but I would like to ask this question, also coming from Neil. Do you have any thoughts about the issues of recyclability of the primary packaging, cosmetics or fragrances? What could be rule and regulations about it? Does anybody know about this? In terms of what are the regulations about recyclability of primary packaging?
No, in the EU, there's no regulation for that kind of packaging. At the moment, there is a regulation on single-use plastic, but there is no regulation on, in general, packaging. There is, of course, the wish to reduce packaging, and there's also a wish to create more packaging with less, let's say, complicated packaging, you know, that packaging that might have paper, plastic, and, you know, aluminium, which you can find, which might be more difficult to recycle. But the actual requirement is that if your packaging is recyclable, you know, your country and your town should push towards recycling packaging and creating, and companies, of course, should, I believe, create less impactful packaging that consumes less CO2, which will pollute less, use less water. So reduction of the packaging is for sure the first rule, and then, you know, recyclable and reducing, you know, of course, the other rules. The difficulty there is mainly if your country and your town, as we know, every city might have a different recycling management. That is where we need to implement, and that is where we need, you know, everybody, even as individuals, interested in their local, you know, politics, and try to push so that, you know, the city, the town, you know, pushes towards recycling. And if there are products that are difficult to recycle, well, let's find new ways. There are a lot of new companies and new startups that are creating really innovative products. I have found a company in France, a company in the UK that is recycling, you know, these new little products that we're using so much in Italy. We're still using them a lot, and, you know, they're just ending up in landfill. So there is a way to do it. So why not, you know, let's push, you know, our inventives. And, you know, during lockdown, I think that a lot of startups have been creating, because people were at home and maybe not knowing what to do, and they were, you know, thinking of ways to create, you know, something new. And, you know, innovation and technology is for sure one of the ways to get out of the pandemic problem that we've been living in the past 2 years.
Thank you so much, Emma. And I'd like to start with you, Joe. What is your thought? What can you tell the people to start doing in terms of understanding a little bit more legislation? Where can they go and find out more? And most importantly, what's your last thought in terms of what is the recommendation?
Yeah, okay. So it's quite a lot in that. So yeah, it's there's a lot to keep track of. I think Positive Luxury, you put out a newsletter just today, sort of summarising the position on some of the upcoming legislation. What I would say is, just make sure that you're subscribed to those types of newsletters. Baker and McKenzie, we're running a series of webinars on the topic of demystifying ESG, which is not just around reporting, but generally ESG, keeping abreast of ESG trends and legislation. So, and that's open to all. You'd be very welcome to attend those webinars, and we're putting out a lot of materials as well, trying to keep track of this mushrooming of legislation. But I think I also think a plug for the FT's Moral Money newsletter. For me, that's the best sort of news aggregator of ESG related topics, certainly this side of the Atlantic. So I would definitely recommend that to everyone. I'm not affiliated to the FT at all. I just think that newsletter is brilliant. So those are the ways that, to kind of keep track, because if you sort of try and do it all yourself from first sources, you will be there a long time.
Yeah.
The last point I would leave you with, though, sort of links back to what Reagan was saying earlier, and it picks up on one of the questions that came in through the chat, which is the integration of sustainability issues, ESG considerations at the highest levels, tone from the top in businesses. And these are easy words to say, they're really hard to do, but for me, this is absolutely the key question. It's probably the key question for this group working in the luxury industries. But to my mind, what is happening, I genuinely see happening, and it's not happening everywhere in business. It's not happening entirely across the board, but I see it as a movement, and it's gaining traction, is really this idea of rethinking the purpose of business. Why are you in this business rather than any other business that you might be in? What is? I heard it framed very nicely as, what is the problem of people or planet that your business is trying to solve? And what I really do see, the shift that is happening, is that those in charge of organizations are starting to think differently in many cases about the role of business, and profit being an engine of it and the oxygen of it, as I heard it mentioned. These are not social enterprises, they're not charities, they're profit-making businesses, but actually profit is an enabler and not the end goal. And that sense of purpose, doing the right thing because it's the right thing to do, is featuring far more in conversations that I'm having with business leaders than ever it was in previous years. So so I suppose, to wrap it up, I would say, in terms of thinking through what all of this means for your business, for your organization, it's that understanding of the way that this is not just an overlay to strategy, but needs to be an essential part of it. And every function of your business needs to be involved and pulling in the same direction. I think that's the point I would leave you with.
Thank you very much, Joanna. Actually, we ran out of time, but I want to thank you, everybody, for your time and your energy, and all your thoughts. And I hope to see you soon. And I would like to hand it over to Claudia. Thank you very much for today.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time, Emma, Joe, and Reagan. Please head over to positiveluxury.com now to download your copy of our new bulletin, and email us at hello@positiveluxury.com if you have any questions or any feedback. We want to hear from you. We'll be back in October with a new webinar on biodiversity. And until then, take care and stay safe. Thank you. Bye.